Hey, Emma.
Yes, Madelyn.
What do you call it when you've got really long hair and it gets tangled and it just feels like you can never, ever, ever get it untangled and it goes on forever?
I don't know. What do you call it?
Eternal Strands! Hello and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your sin host, Madelyn.
I'm your ice and fire host, Emma.
Why didn't you say punishment? You were supposed to say punishment.
I thought that seemed too obvious.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. This week, we're talking about sin and punishment, just the concepts in general. Is this the third time I've made that joke? Probably. And Eternal Strands.
I feel like you could have worked sin and punishment into your joke somewhere.
Almost certainly, but sin and punishment is actually harder to make something out of, because it's not two of the same thing, right? It's like a cause and effect.
Right.
So it's a little harder to craft than you would think. This is a little behind the scenes of how I think about creating my jokes.
Yeah.
So at first when I started looking into sin and punishment, I was like, where did Emma get this game? Like a 2000 Japan only rail shooter. I was like, this is a weird pick. And then the more I read it, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. But at first I was like, this is
I think I was
bold.
looking at N64 games.
Yeah.
Just sort of specifically, and I found this one. So
That's reasonable. So sin and punishment, which I have written as sin and punishments in my notes, apparently.
No, it's just the singular punishment.
Singular sin, singular punishment.
This is just like Eiyuden Chronicle. It's
one punishment.
One punishment.
One only.
One chronicle.
It's a rail shooter, co-developed by Treasure and Nintendo for the Nintendo 64, released only in Japan in 2000. I thought where you had actually gotten it is that it's, on Nintendo Switch Online now.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yes, it came to the West via the Wii Shop channel eventually. But even on its initial release, it already had an English dub, which I think is really funny.
It's just an era, Nintendo of America was kind of floundering at this point, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And it was kind of the end of the life cycle of the N64, sort of, so...
Yeah, I think that was the main thing, is that they're really trying to push the GameCube. So this did not end up being prioritized.
Poor Sin and Punishment. It was quite popular as kind of a cult classic import.
Yeah.
Of course, because it already had the English voice track. I did find a contemporary article from IGN in 2000 that was like, here's how to translate Sin and Punishment's Japanese menus. Here they are in English. I was like, that's great. That's crazy.
Yeah.
A different time.
It got a decent amount of reviews for being a Japan only title, just from people importing it.
Well, it's pretty cool. It's a pretty neat game. I gotta say, I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, but it's always a treat when an old Nintendo game or any Nintendo game has an Iwata Asks article.
Yeah, true.
I was reading, as is my usual start for researching the podcast, I was reading the Wikipedia page on Sin and Punishment. I was like, this is so much information for a random 25-year-old rail shooter that has one sequel. It's so much detail about the plot and about the development. I was like, oh, it's because of this article.
Yeah, I think that Iwata Asks was specifically for the sequel, but they did talk a lot about the original release too. Which
and
the
we'll
sequel
circle back.
Was brought over here within the same year, for what it's worth. So
that one was in 2009 for the Wii. But Sin and Punishment, which was released in 2000, takes place in, quote, the near future of 2007.
Yeah, the dystopia of 2007.
Which even in the Iwata Asks, they were like, the near future of 2007? Ha ha ha, that's over. Because that was 2009. But rail shooters always have like more plot than you would expect them to have.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I'm shooting little bullet guys, but like you've
And
got a
it's
whole
a
world
really
for me.
short game also.
Yeah.
But they pack some stuff in there. It does feel very like vibes based, and you get some of the more specifics from like the manual, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot going on in this game.
So here we go. Let's take a seat, settle down into Madelyn's lore corner here. So yes, it's 2007, the future.
Yeah.
And there's a famine. That's bad. So scientists have decided that the way they're going to fix this famine is that they're going to like build a new animal to eat. Basically, they've genetically engineered a new animal that they're going to use and eat, and oops, they mutate into monsters called ruffians.
Yes.
My bad. Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Uh-huh.
So the ruffians start terrorizing the population, and of course then we have a militia sort of group called the Armed Volunteers who form to stop them. But they're also, like, you know, bad.
Yes.
As army militia groups that spring up to stop genetically mutated food animals often are.
Yes, a lot of the things I read were like, this is just the U.S. Army called something else. So,
oops,
for what it's worth.
So in the game, you play as Saki and Iron, who are working with someone named Achi as like a third group. Everything describes it as a third group. One group, to be clear, is like mad cows.
Yeah. The 30 to 50 feral hogs.
The 30 to 50. That's crazy that this game is about 30 to 50 feral hogs. 30 to 50 feral hogs has really stuck with me. Not every... but that one is really embedded. So you're working to defend Japan against like both the U.S. Army and the feral hogs. But eventually Saki falls into some blood, as one does.
Yeah.
Which turns him into a feral hog.
Yeah.
So Achi's like, you can save him, but only if you shoot him. And you're like, I don't know. That's my husband, I think. Partner. Certainly.
Yeah.
So Achi's like, look at the future. And you live on Long Island now. with your boy.
In the near future of 2017.
The near future. The medium near future of 2017. You live on Long Island with your boy. And your son. But you get tricked into shooting Saki anyway. And surprise! I mean, spoilers? Do we care about spoilers in a 25-year-old rail shooter?
I think it's fine.
Achi's actually an alien who's trying to turn Saki into a warrior weapon to fight other aliens and rule a new Earth.
Yeah.
Should have guessed that.
Yeah.
Anyway, ultimately you destroy the new Earth, you send Achi off into space. Saki seems to like now have control over being a ruffian or not. That wasn't really clear to me how that happened.
There's like a combining that happens. So he like combines with Ion. And that like helps control him, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
But little stinger at the end. Achi is thinking about the possibility of using their son, Issa, as a weapon in the future.
Yeah. ...
To be continued in Sin and Punishment Star Successor.
Yep.
9 years later.
Exactly. So this game was a lot of the inspiration for this game was one, Nintendo at the time was working on like a motion control device that they didn't end up releasing at this time, but that Treasure was interested in. And also, if you know what the N64 controller looks like, it has like 3 prongs, right? If you picture a normal controller now, you've got 2 prongs, right, that you hold. But the Nintendo one had another one in the middle. And usually the way you would hold it is you would have your like left hand on the middle one and your right hand on the right one in a right grip.
And the reason for that, by the way, at least per the Sin and Punishment Iwata asks, is that that's how they set it up for Super Mario 64.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, oh, we liked that.
Yeah. Well, it's like the analog stick's in the middle. So
yeah, just one.
Just one. And then the face buttons are on the right. So that's sort of like the natural place to go. But you can also do the left grip, where you have the analog stick on your right hand and the D-pad on your left hand. And so Treasure specifically wanted to make a game for the left grip, which they felt like was underutilized in N64 games.
Why did they design the controller that way?
Because they like making cool stuff, Madelyn.
I know. It's just, like, you look at it and you're like, I don't have 3 hands. Like, who thought... I don't know. I had to remind myself, because they were talking about this, you know, D-pad and control stick scheme that we will talk about for Sin and Punishment in a moment. And I was like, I just wasn't thinking about what a Nintendo 64 controller looked like. I was like, that doesn't seem like super possible.
Yeah.
If it's the left stick and the D-pad, like, what are you doing? And of course, it's totally possible with the N64, but it also calls into sharp relief that this is a weird-looking controller that doesn't make a lot of sense.
But anyway, the reason it's like that is Sin and Punishment is like a shoot 'em up. So you use it's the D-pad to control your character, and then the analog stick to control your reticle.
Unless you're in left-handed mode.
Well, right. Yes. But one of them you can move your character like back and forth. Sometimes they're like auto running too, but most of yours is still like just moving from side to side. And then you have your shooting reticle that you can move around the screen in order to shoot the enemies coming at you. The successor on the Wii did actually make use of the motion control. You point.
And the nunchuck.
Yes. So you point your Wiimote at the screen and actually use it like a point and click, right? And then with the Joy-Con, I said, with the nunchuck, you move your character.
It's a real bummer they haven't decided to give the Switch 2 some weird controllers.
Yeah. Apparently you can use it like a mouse, which is interesting to me.
Okay, we'll see.
It has like on one side it has like the laser thing. So you can like put it down like a mouse and click.
Okay, we'll see.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think you can slash, and I don't really know how the slashing works. You can also like slash things in both the games, which with the Wiimote is obviously like you're making a slashing motion, but I don't know how it works on the original, actually.
I'm not 100% sure either. But all this to say, it's like kind of funky for a rail shooter. It's not usual to be able to kind of control in both axes that way.
Yes.
So it's a weird little setup. There's also apparently a co-op mode, at least for the virtual console re-release, where one person moves and one person shoots.
Yes. I thought that was fun.
Well, that sounds to me like overcooked levels of breakup potential. It just sounds really hard.
Well, I think you're not really interfering with each other in that case, right? Like, if you're moving, that doesn't affect where the reticle is going. So it's really, I guess just that's like, true. You're not messing each other up. You're just doing good or bad. So it's a little bit less.
That's fair. I had sort of thought about it as like, yeah, maybe like the movement affected the aiming, but you're right. It definitely doesn't. Yeah. So never mind. I take it back. It's not overcooked levels of breakup fuel.
Yeah. My favorite anecdote from the Iwata Asks was he was talking to Yamagami, who was like Nintendo's representative producer on this game, essentially. Yeah. And one, I thought it was really funny that he was like, they would not tell me when they thought they would be done. They just kept saying, I don't know, when it's ready, you know?
Yes, the quote from Yamagami is, he's like, it was among my top 3 most difficult games to develop. I screenshotted this because I also thought it was funny. As for what was so difficult, usually when you ask when it will be done, the director will give you an estimated date. And Iwata says, well, they can make the date is another thing, but they will give you an estimate. And Yamagami says, but with Treasure, they say, we don't know. We'll show you something when it's done. I'd say, well, that causes some trouble. And they'd say, but if we don't know, we don't know. We went back and forth like that for a long time.
But my favorite part of it is when it was ready, and they showed it to him.
Oh, yeah.
He said, it's too difficult. I can't do it. And Treasure responded, then you're not good enough to be in charge of this project.
Like, we can't have anyone on the team. Our whole team can do it.
Yes. Yeah, he followed up with, but normal people can't do this. And they said, everyone in our company can do it. Anyone who can't do this can't be on our team.
He did eventually succeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
They
Get
did
in to make it a little easier.
They did get them to make it a little bit easier. Funnily enough, the sequel, Nintendo actually insisted that they make it more difficult. Because, one, Treasure was known for making difficult games, right? So that was part of their identity. But because the sequel used the motion controls, is actually a lot easier in terms of control scheme to use the motion controls than it is to use the analog stick. So even though it was like fundamentally kind of the same, because the actual point and shoot is like more natural, right? It makes it so it wasn't as difficult to actually play.
That's so interesting to me, because when I read about the motion control shooting, I was like, that feels like a lot for my brain to handle. So maybe it's just like in theory, and in practice it would be really simple.
Yeah. I can't remember. I watched a couple videos on this, but I can't remember which one was talking about this. But they mentioned like a lot of shooters will introduce like gyroscopic controls eventually. And like once you switch over to that, you start like swearing by it, right? Like there's a little adjustment period, but then after you do it, it's very hard to switch back.
Okay. Whatever you say, YouTuber.
I do get this, I think about like playing a shooter on controller versus playing it with like a mouse, for example. That's sort of like a small similarity, right? The mouse moves a lot faster than the analog stick, and you can be more precise in where you're going. And so that's why a lot of FPSs are, and third-person shooters are easier on PC if you're used to keyboard and mouse.
My favorite part of the Iwata Asks interview was the whole second section where they were talking with the programmer, basically. And he's just like, this was impossible. This was so hard. He's just like sighing. It was so painful. All sorts of things that it's like, oh yeah, like I guess that is hard. He's like, well, this is their first 3D game at Treasure, and so he's like, well, the game was in 3D, but like your aiming mechanism obviously is in 2D, right? So he says, the programmer Nakagawa, who's then like the director on the next game, right, says you have to use 2D aiming to hit a 3D opponent with a bullet. I was like, how am I supposed to do that? So he's like, okay, so I figured that out. And then he goes, but next, parentheses, makes a pained face, which is just like over and over here. So it's like, he figured out how to get it so you could hit the opponents, but then he was like, but then the opponents wouldn't hit you. And I actually thought it was kind of interesting the way he described that. He was like, well, like a lot of the times, like if you can't see the player character, right? If it's just like a shooter, like a first person shooter, it doesn't matter if the bullets are actually hitting you. Right? Because you can't see it. He says you can fudge it. But when you've got the visible player character, like in Sin and Punishment, the bullets have to actually hit you or it feels very unfair.
Yeah.
Right? So he had to figure that out. And then he spends a bunch of time being like, and this I think will be an overlap point with our second game, that, you have bosses. And bosses have to be big or they're not a boss.
Right.
But because it was 3D, they're like far away, right? And they're at the back of the screen.
Right.
And so
because
at first
you are at the front of the screen moving back and forth, shooting into the screen to lay out the perspective of what Sin and Punishment is.
Yes. And so the problem then is with the boss, like, quote unquote far away, they're tiny. They look small.
Right.
And so they were like, that's not a boss. And then they tried to move them close. But then it was like, it's just a foot. He says, you would think, well, this is probably a boss, although maybe it's actually just a foot. So it just sounds like this guy had a real hard time.
You're learning something new, right?
Yeah.
One other anecdote from this interview that it was just interesting because it's something I haven't really thought of before, was they were talking about titling it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they mentioned that, like, at the time, doing katakana titles was really popular. Which, if you're not familiar with Japanese script at all, they have 3 different scripts. They have kanji, which are full symbols that can make up words. There's hiragana, which represents each one of its syllables in sort of the normal script. And then there's katakana, which is sort of meant to mostly be used for, like, loan words. It's essentially the same as hiragana, but you use it for things that have been taken from other languages. So, for example, Perfect Dark, when it came out, was called, like, Red and Black in katakana, for example.
No, in kanji.
What?
Isn't Perfect Dark the katakana and Red and Black the kanji?
I thought it was the other way around.
Maybe I'm mixing it up. Doesn't matter.
But because there were so many katakana titles, it could also mean that you would get lost in the shuffle of katakana titles. So they added on, like, the kanji subtitle, which something you can do with kanji is you can use a kanji that typically doesn't mean something, but give it an alternate reading through the use of furigana, which is like little hiragana above the kanji to show you how to pronounce it. So they're using the kanji for earth, but pronounced as star, essentially. Hence the subtitle of Successor of the Earth, right?
Yeah.
But pronounced as star.
Double meaning.
I know, it's very interesting, but I don't think about, like, how do you, like, when do you choose to title your game in, like, kanji versus katakana, right? And what does that actually do to your, like, discoverability in the Japanese game market, right? I hadn't thought about that at all before.
No, not even a little bit.
It's super interesting to me.
The original title was Glass Soldier, which is pretty cool, too, but it's hard to beat. Like, Sin and Punishment.
Yeah.
That's pretty sick.
They thought about Dark Wasteland for a while, too, which is pretty bad.
Yeah, that one's no good.
That one's no good.
Like, Glass Soldier, good. Dark Wasteland, no good. Sin and Punishment, good.
Yeah.
The sequel also got really great reviews. People love a rail shooter.
Yeah. There's not very many of them anymore.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah.
We like to be able to run around, feel free.
Yeah.
The wind on our faces.
I feel like if there's most, like, big rail shooters I know are just, like, part of a game that's not a rail shooter. Like,
yeah, it's like we're gonna have a rail shooter section.
like Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah. Everybody loves that.
They do. The people that, I mean, not the first game, but the people who are into, like, the rail shooters do really like 2 and 3, is the impression I've gotten.
Really? That's so funny. Maybe I just really actually don't like rail shooters. That's possible. Well, I do wish more people would make more games set in the near future of 7 years from now.
Yeah. So true.
I mean, I guess you'd have to start now with, like, the near... This game did take 3 years to develop, which is, like, wildly long for 1997 to 2000.
Yeah.
But I guess now you would have to start with, like, 15 years in the future.
Yeah.
Which will end up as, like, 7 by the time the game comes out.
Yeah. Well, shall we move on to
Eternal Strands?
Yeah, Eternal Strands. I blanked
one of our
on the
newer
name.
ever games. Yes,
it came out last month, right?
Yeah, like less than a month ago. January 28th.
Mm-hmm.
So 2025, third-person action-adventure game it's the debut title from Yellow Brick Games. Came out for PS5, Windows, and the Xbox XS. Just last month.
Yes. Yellow Brick is made up of a lot of Ubisoft and BioWare. What is the word?
Expats.
Expats, sure. Yeah.
Guys. Whenever somebody talks about working at BioWare, they're like, I'm a BioWare guy.
Well, yeah. I think it's an unfortunate result of their company culture, right?
Well, I know. I just think it's funny that it's like it's always that exact phrasing. And yeah. Like, I'm a BioWare guy.
But yes, made up of a lot of BioWare and Ubisoft former devs. So we're just on a like string of talking about games from people who've left the AAA space and moved on to their own things, which is nice, I guess.
It's true. It's also an interesting counterpoint, like Sin and Punishment was like, oh, we started with 4 people and eventually it was really big. And this one here is they're like, I want to make a tiny game with just about 70 people.
Yeah.
So, how scale has changed.
Yes. So tell us about Eternal Strands, Madelyn. What kind of game is it? I will do my best.
So Eternal Strands, many people liked this story and then some people didn't, right? A lot of kind of polarizing takes on almost everything about Eternal Strands in the reviews, to be honest.
I did think they did talk about their decisions for how the story is in the various interviews, but lay it out first before we get into it.
Okay, so in Eternal Strands, you play as Brynn, who's a warrior, a weaver, as we call it, who basically, in this universe, there's these magic users called weavers, and there was a big magic explosion, basically, in a city now known as the Enclave, where once that happened, we're scared of magic now. We don't like magic magic bad, and they've also been locked out of this kind of ancestral home city, the Enclave, and so Brynn, who is a magic user, young woman weaver, and her weaver band of buddies, want to get back into that enclave through the barriers, whatever, and find out what happened and what's going on behind the barrier, using magic and fun to do so.
Yeah. So they did a very long Laidlaw and Saint Laurent, who I think are the creative director and producer, designer, their leadership at Yellow Brick. And they did talk about in this interview, they did not intend for this to be a story heavy game. Laidlaw was talking about in BioWare games and those RPGs like that, a lot of times the story has dilemmas, right? And then you make decisions responding to those dilemmas. And in this game, they're not thinking about dilemmas. They have mechanics and interactions, essentially. So there's stuff you're having story that gives context as to why, why am I doing this? Why am I hunting this creature? Why are the credits rolling now? Right? They answer those basic questions. And then you can have a bit more optional characterful interaction, which seems to be something that they sort of added a little bit more later, actually, to hang out with your friends, right? And maybe do some optional quest lines for them. But it's not you're making choices, really, right? You're just sort of hanging out. And both of them talked about they really this was an action first game, in contrast to, BioWare, which is very much more story first kind of games.
Well, and that really jives with kind of the gameplay system as well, I would say. There was, I couldn't read this whole thing because I'm not subscribed to his blog, whatever. God, can we just have Legacy Media back? But there was a quote from Laidlaw on Stephen Totillo's blog. Totillo? I don't know. It's got to be Totillo, right?
Probably.
Talking about, okay, so in this game, right, the big thing of this game is you have fire magic and you have ice magic and you have telekinesis, basically. And the whole idea of this game is it's in some sense very Breath of the Wild inspired, right? You can climb anything, you've got a stamina bar, whatever. And it's also kind of immersive sim-y, theoretically, in that you can use your fire and your ice and telekinesis to solve puzzles in kind of potentially unexpected ways.
Yes.
They should have gotten some people from the Trine team on this, saying that out loud. But basically, so the creative director, says in a quote on this blog, this idea about how like their like lead programmer or whatever has this vision with the physics and a set of consistent rules. Players should be able to be surprised by what just happened, but also work out why it happened. So to that end, we took the approach that nothing in the game should be a custom flame attack. It's just an attack that emits heat of X intensity over Y time. From there, the systems take over. The air is all voxel based, and temperature conducts and convects, and materials in the game have ignition points and their own statistics for how much more heat they emit when they burn.
Yes.
So the idea being that they're not just like, we press the fire button. It's like, no, it's all based on like one system, which I thought was really interesting. And definitely bears out in how some people talk about the experience of using those powers.
Yes, there's a game developer profile as well on how they cooked up an ambitious physics system with a small team, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, like there's like 2x2 air cells everywhere that are constantly tracking like the temperature-ness. And then various objects have sensors that can track that temperature and then determine what behavior to display. And then they talked about like, and so after we made that decision, that made various other decisions for us. So like it's not a true open world, right? Because we couldn't sustain like tracking that on a true open world and make this like scalable for us. So you have various zones you can go to instead. They talked a lot, like this game developer one in their interview in Game Rant, like how controlled they were about their whole process. They said like, we had our initial pitch and this game is essentially the same as it was in the initial pitch, except we have slightly longer mission structure than we thought we would at the first time. Like that's like the main change that they made.
Yeah.
They were very proactive with cutting things like immediately, but also like because they decided on these core systems to begin with, they could use those core systems to add like some interesting features to the game. So like you can like use enemy attacks essentially to like change what drops, right? If you have them like make you hold a boulder up to like refine it or whatever, it'll then drop higher quality things, for example. So you can do like combat smelting is what they call it.
That's sick.
And that wasn't like an initial thing. That's something they thought about. And because they had this temperature system, it was relatively smooth to implement and add into the game. So it was very interesting to read about like, the development process and just how like controlled they kept it. They really took a production first approach, I guess, is the way to describe it.
No, it's cool. And it is sort of, I don't know, once you start to really get into the reviews, you start to see that, oh, this was a small team game. Yeah. But in talking about it, it definitely doesn't sound that way, like at all.
Yeah.
Which is neat. Other things, like the big kind of structure of the game is that there are a bunch of like big kind of Shadow of the Colossus or Monster Hunter, take your pick, style bosses that you have to fight.
Yes.
And having watched a few of those battles, it's like, oh, that's cool.
Yes.
More games should let you climb big guy.
Yes, there's the climbing element. You can use stuff like your ice, for example. I saw one clip where like you've climbed onto the back of a dragon and it takes off and you freeze one of its wings and therefore forces it to land because it can't fly anymore. So just it's very central to like, you have these tools. Okay, what can you do with these tools now based on the way that we've made this system work?
But here's what, and this comes into sharp relief thinking about, okay, so Sin and Punishment, right? Didn't sell great, whatever. Real cult classic, though. People really liked it. Some, like, cool systems experimenting, right? That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. This game, man, I really feel like the Polygon, Impressions article title, unfortunately really sums it up, which is, Eternal Strands is the Forspoken of 2025, parentheses, complimentary. And I was like, oh boy.
People are a lot more, I feel like people like Eternal Strands more than the general populace liked Forspoken, though.
Yes, that's correct. But it does sort of sum up a lot of the games that we've talked about as new games recently, which are, I mean, okay, in this article goes on to say, right, it's Ari Notice, Eternal Strands is ultimately what I like to call a Forspoken-like, which, come on, no, come up with you need a better thing than that. Forspoken, if you'll recall, blah, blah, blah. It featured a fascinating magic system, but took place in an utterly nonsensical fantasy realm that was pilloried, some might say unfairly, for featuring some groan-worthy dialogue. Immortals of Avium, which we also talked about,
yes,
right, it is another example of a Forspoken-like. Some readers might call these 7 out of 10 games, a reasonable quip to which I have no retort. You're not wrong. And that's what I think is really tricky. If you read the reviews for, I'm trying to say Forspoken now. I'm like Shadows of Avium. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
For Eternal Strands, many of them people are like, this is the first like sleeper hit of the year. Like, this is a great game. There's like cool things happening in this game. Blah blah blah. But also many of the reviews are like, this is a 7 out of 10. And that's like literally, that's not sustainable. You actually can't make a 7 out of 10 game anymore.
I don't, because they were so focused and they're so small, I do feel like that contrasts them from something like Forspoken or even something like Immortals of Avium, which I think was a small team, but clearly had bigger ambitions just based on like the actors that were in that game, you could tell, right?
That's fair. I mostly just mean to say, as I read more about this game, it seemed cool and I was interested in playing it, but in like the first look at it, it was interesting to me. I read a whole sort of IGN preview where they talked a lot about the art direction and like wanting it to look painterly. They use the word painterly a lot. And while some reviews I read eventually got into like the use of color here is really cool and like over time like works really well, when I just look at a like 2-minute sizzle reel for this game, it looks pretty much like any of these other games.
It's not nearly as it's not photorealistic though.
I'm not saying photorealistic. It just, oh man.
I mean, I don't think it has a hugely unique art style, but I do think people are gravitating away from the photorealism. That's another point of difference with like Forspoken and Immortals, right?
Yes.
Is that those were clearly photorealistic games.
What is the one where the gods are talking in your brain?
The what or what?
The Greek gods are like they're like,
oh yes,
yapping at
Phoenix Rising, which I do think a lot of the devs, it's a lot of the same devs.
That would make sense then,
because that was an Ubisoft title.
I just mean to say that this kind of game that has some kind of cool systems happening, God, it's so much harder for it to break out. And I'm glad they kept it small, but like, man, if this team had been any bigger, and even still, I'm sort of like, okay, but like, are layoffs coming?
Yeah, we'll see.
Like,
yeah.
Because the systems sound dope. I mean, they sound janky. Many of the reviews are like, actually, like, when you really, like, sometimes they don't work quite the way you want them to, and like, it's hard. But like, dang, like the description, there's so many good descriptions of like weird stuff that reviewers did. Like, I love this one from RPS. They're like, rock, paper, shotgun,
right,
to be clear. Past a certain point, I was setting myself on fire so regularly that I gave in and constructed a suit of armor that made me functionally fireproof. That's already good.
Yeah.
But then better. I found a spell that summoned a small fiery boy to follow me around, but warned me that if he took enough damage, he'd explode. Fair enough, I said. No skin off my nose. Freed from having to worry about flames, the fiery boy became a go-to problem solver. A heavy wooden door I couldn't open, pick up the lad with magic and fling him so hard at the obstacle that both exploded. Thank you for your service, my son.
Very good.
Like, that's good. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
And also so many of the reviews being like, all the time you're going to be fighting, and it's just going to denigrate into like, everything's on fire, help, ice everywhere, throw things. Like, love that. Love the energy. Well, I mean, theoretically at least, love the energy of that. But man, like hard to break out. Hard to break out is like janky cool.
I mean, I heard people talking about this one on release.
Yeah. That's
which
something. Well, it's
more
like Game Pass day one.
Yeah, Game Pass day one too, which I don't know how much that helps anymore. But like just to keep picking on Immortals. Definitely did not hear anyone talking about that on release. You know.
It's true. It has a little bit of buzz. This just feels like the kind of game that would have been like true cult classic if it had, if anything, even, you know, at N64 levels of being able to do this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Had come out then, be like, oh yeah, like remember that game where you could control fire and ice and you kept setting yourself on fire? That would be like, people would be like, when is Bryn coming to Smash?
Right.
And this feels like, oh, like I hope that you guys use that, like, get to make another game.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of the unfortunate times that we live in.
It does sound cool. I'm like I certainly cannot play it now.
A little busy.
Because I just really need to buckle down and finish Final Fantasy before my boy takes me out to sea. But it sounds cool. The RPS review also like made the mention of like it's not really fair to compare this to like the telekinesis in Control,
right,
or like something like that, because obviously the budget isn't fair to like put those two things against each other, but that's hard. Here's a question for you. Do you feel like the makers of these kinds of like sort of vague fantasy games need to stop using fantasy words?
No.
So many of the reviews I read were like, oh god, like Enclave, Weavers, like...
I don't understand why people hate fantasy words so much. Those aren't even hard fantasy words. Like, come on. Weaver? Like, I'm 100% certain there's things that I've used Weaver for Magic users before.
Oh, I am
like,
too.
That's just like, yeah, of course, Weaver. That's not even weird.
Like,
yeah, I
funny?
just want
like,
my
can you
magic
imagine, though,
users.
a game that just came out and was like, you're a wizard.
Yeah.
And you're fighting a vampire.
Yeah. Trying.
And a zombie. Oh, yeah.
You're right. We do want more trines.
We do want more trine. It's always a fine time for trine time.
But no, I just like, it's like, oh yeah, just suck all the whimsy out of this thing is sort of what it feels like to me.
That's true. That's very true.
But I do love a good fricked up fantasy term, you know? So that is a little bit on me.
That's on you.
Well, shall we mash?
Yeah. Okay. Gotta be a small team, I guess.
What is that? That doesn't add. That's not a mashup, Alan.
Well, it means that we can't like try to create something. Like there's a version where we're like, it's a rail shooter, but you like have like crazy control of like fire and ice. Like it can't feel high budget.
I do feel like it would be interesting.
Like somebody is struggling, and when Iwata comes back from the dead to ask them a question, they should sigh. That's the energy this game should have.
No, it would be interesting to have like a rail shooter where you could sort of switch between the types of bullets you were using, and maybe that affects like different enemies differently or different parts of the environment.
Sure. Something about the rail shooter, like there's a tension here between the very fixed forward momentum of a rail shooter and the kind of like sandboxy use your powers to solve environmental and boss-based puzzles of Eternal Strands. That's something that we need to figure out how to balance. Because you're right, like different types of bullets, rail shooter kind of thing. That's a definitely a potential mashup, but I do think it loses something spiritually, perhaps.
Maybe you could, because some of the levels in Sin and Punishment are you're running also, right, forward.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something you could do with like being able to make alternate paths for yourself. Like you see like a big wave of enemies coming and you go, actually, or like you're coming up on a wall, and so maybe you can choose like, okay, I'll just fire blast this wall and burst through it, or you're like, I'll use my ice to make myself like a new winding path and take a different approach through this area, right? It might not be as free, like there might be certain points where you're making those choices, right? Or it just, I'll use my gravity magic and I'll boost up to the next girder on the ceiling, right? Or whatever. And so you can sort of approach it in a platforming kind of way too, in addition to a shooting kind of way.
Yeah, a rapid problem solving.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, like sort of the idea of it being not so much like, oh, like the constant struggle is how do I destroy this flying dragon thing. It's like, okay, I've like got something coming up, like which of my abilities can I use quickly to get past this. Ultimately what we've created here is the genre platformer, but
but like auto-scrolling platformer, right?
Yeah. Nobody's ever done that.
I'm sure they have, yeah. But there would still be some combat in there too,
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a little bit more like fast-paced too, which would be interesting.
Okay. I can dig that. Could also just introduce more aliens into the story of Eternal Strands.
So any story, I think, could use some aliens, honestly.
Any story could stand to have 30 to 50 feral aliens.
Yeah. No gamer is sick of space, is what I've heard. Everybody still loves space.
We all freaking love space. Could also just tweak the story of Eternal Strands so that they, they go into the ruined city or whatever, the abandoned city, and there's just like chickens running around, like feral chickens.
Okay, yeah.
Chickens some kind of like feral animal everywhere.
Known for going feral, chickens.
Hey, look, this is gonna be when we're all locked in for the bird flu. We'll come back to this prescient moment.
That's right. That's true.
When eggs cost $100 each.
The chickens are saving their funds for their when they're paid for their egg services.
That's how it works.
Yeah. They're stocking up.
Their nest egg.
Exactly. Good work. Good job. You got it.
Don't say it like that. Don't say good work, good job like that. Yeah, it's because it is tough, right? Yeah, it does sort of feel like it has to be built on the rail shooter because the rest of the story of Sin and Punishment is too... It's cool. It's like very Madelyn lore, but it isn't... There's nothing so distinctive about it.
Right.
Oh, yes, there is. This game is set in the near future.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
Like 2032.
Yeah. That's an important element. You're right.
Highly important element. That alone would get us some coverage, I think. People would be like, ha ha ha, the near future of 2032.
Get some think pieces going.
Exactly. Gotta dangle some bait in front of people. Say, write a little blog post about us. Write a little blog post. It's a rail shooter. Don't you love that? I think that's pretty solid. The auto-scrolling platformer with some combat. God. I think that's pretty solid, she says, describing probably 100 games on Steam. Honestly, not to be too, like, man who's only played Limbo, like, wants a Limbo like this. But I feel like if we could make the death, like, the ways that you die sort of, like, funny, interesting, chaotic enough, that we could kind of blow up on, Twitch and YouTube. We like get the variety streamers on this, too.
Absolutely. All right, are we done?
I think that's a solid. I think it's a solid pitch. I don't really know what the story of the game is, but doesn't matter. Fine.
We'll figure it out. We'll put it in the manual. It
needs to have some story MacGuffin elements for sure.
Sure.
But that'll come. It also needs to be too hard for a while.
Yeah.
Perfect. All set. Listeners, what do you think? Are you gonna buy our 2032 rail shooter? Should I just call it a... Wait, what is the name of the game where you have to... Is it 2038? 2048.
2048, yeah.
Should I just call it 2048?
Sure.
That seems fine from an SEO perspective.
Yeah. No problems there.
Right. No, it's too far. 2048 is actually the future. Listeners, would you play our mashup game? Do you want more games where you have chaotic control of the elements that rate no higher than a 7.5 out of 10 with reviewers? I do. Do you want more games that inexplicably only come out in a foreign country but have an English dub, where IGN will translate the menus for you? Do you want more games where there are aliens? If you have thoughts about this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com. You can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat we're about to pull from, and read our blog featuring all sorts of good games and games-adjacent bloggy content. Next week on the show, it's 6 weeks in gaming.
Yeah. I've got a good one.
Oh, God. My stomach just churned. So look forward to hearing about what we've been playing these past 6 weeks. But Emma, in 2 weeks, in March, I guess it will be March next time as well. I just can't count. What will we be talking about?
In 2 weeks, for our old game, we'll be talking about God Hand.
Oh, nice.
And for our new game, we'll be talking about Marvel Rivals.
Ah, I was just seeing a bunch about Marvel Rivals.
Yes, big news in the Marvel Rivals space, unfortunately.
God, Marvel Rivals is so fun to say.
It is. It's pretty good. It's good mouthfeel.
Marvel Rivals. Somebody did a good job there. So in 2 weeks, look forward to that. But listeners, that's this week's show. Thanks for tuning in. Emma, send us out. Send us off.
This week, I hope that the alien who chooses you is only a really nice gal.